Now attention all shipping, especially in sea area Finisterre. The Meteorological Office issued the following gale warning to shipping at 1030 GMT. Finisterre, severe gale force 9, now veered northerly and decreased gale force 8. Radio 4, it's now 11:35 and time for From Our Own Correspondent. It's introduced by Laurie Macmillan.
Good morning. Most of our foreign correspondents' working lives are spent watching and reporting the political developments of the countries in which they live. Today we've asked 5 of them to get away from politics and tell us about the day-to-day preoccupations of the people all round them. We'll be hearing from China, South Africa, Italy and Egypt. But we begin with Poland, on whose political developments so much attention has been focused this year. What are the other concerns of the Polish people? Our correspondent in Warsaw is Tim Sebastian.
There are times in Poland, and they occur with increasing frequency, when you don't know whether to laugh or cry. Take the story of the state car builders who decided for the first time to transport their vehicles by river barge. They proudly loaded the barges with the brand new shining status symbols, waved them goodbye, and then watched them sink slowly beneath the ripples of the Vistula. Thousands of dollars worth of highly prized machinery came to a halt on the river bed. But that isn't the end of the story, which serves to illustrate the way the Poles often create a problem and then solve it. For the car firm dredged up the sodden wrecks, dried them out, removed the mud and the old boots, and then sold them second-hand for a profit. It's not the kind of pre-sale service that would go down too well in the West, but it didn't deter them. A car is a car in any condition and at any price. And it shows to some extent the way materialism runs rampant in this somewhat deprived communist state. Cars are a bit like beautiful women, to be cared for and cosseted, to be stared at in the street as they go by. For Poles are stylish people, conscious of fashion and elegance. It's not unheard of for them to come up to strangers in the street and ask where they bought their shoes or their coat. Although good clothes are in short supply, the private, expensive boutiques do a thriving trade. So do the beauty clinics, where even men can sometimes be found. This search for elegance goes hand in hand with a type of old-world formality and etiquette. Politeness is second nature to a Pole. If you enter a lift with someone, you're supposed to say thank you when you get out. Similarly, if you share a table in a restaurant. These aren't just idle gestures either, because without them you appear awkward and out of place. Because when you visit people, it's socially unacceptable to turn up empty-handed, even if you just bring a single flower. Ladies are, of course, accorded special privileges. You don't shake their hand, you kiss it, taking care to bow extravagantly from the waist. When you consider the chronic strains of everyday life here, it's perhaps remarkable that these social niceties have survived at all. Outwardly, people are obsessed with other things, like the idea of finding enough food or of getting a flat. It says a lot for their threshold of tolerance that they remain as passive and good-natured as they do. But in some respects, they pay a heavy price all the same. The incidence of alcoholism, for instance, is a national scandal. A Polish judge recently suggested, half-jokingly, that if the people went on drinking as they were now, they'd all be dead by the year 2000. Dead, and in many cases alone as well, for the shortage of accommodation has put an intolerable burden on family life. One man I know left his wife and children a few weeks ago after being told they had another 15 years to wait for a bigger flat. 15 more years in 1.5 rooms was simply an unmanageable equation. It isn't by any means an isolated story. Unlike the other East European capitals, Warsaw has a quick, discernible pulse to it, beating at a high level of excitement. For amidst all the shortages, there's a new commodity on the market, and it's called information, passed by word of mouth in any of the city's hundreds of coffee bars, or even conveyed now by the official media, watched and read with daily astonishment. There's constant talk, too, of the new trade unions. On the street, people openly sport their solidarity badges. For the first time since communism came to Poland 35 years ago, they found a non-party organization to express their social, even political aspirations. The spread of Solidarity's influence has been faster than anyone could have predicted. Living in Poland, I'm constantly amazed at the inventiveness of the people, the army of private engineers who mend objects that would be thrown away instantly in the West, who get round the shortages of goods and spare parts, who've made virtues out of necessities. One car mechanic was about to dismantle a whole engine the other day when he suddenly disappeared underneath the vehicle, banged in a few places, and the engine came to life. God gave us all a head, he said simply. You just have to use it to think. Here in Poland, there's a lot of that sort of practical thinking going on at this very moment.
Tim Sebastian, Warsaw. Change in another and very different communist society, China, is hardly less momentous than that in Poland. We asked our Peking correspondent, Philip Short, about the preoccupations of the Chinese this winter, and he says the answer is very different from what it would have been last year or the year before.
The other day I walked into one of the news agency offices here and half registered as I went in that they'd a new calendar of a Hong Kong film star up on the wall. Only it wasn't from Hong Kong. The girl with the almost too perfect elfin face, wearing a low-cut white jacket and a pearl necklace and earrings, wasn't even from Taiwan, as had been my next thought. She was from communist Peking, and the calendar in question was bought from a kiosk near the railway station. From which spring two thoughts. First, that one subject on which Chinese minds are fixed this winter, which they certainly weren't a few years ago, is girls. Now, before you reach for your pen and bombard the BBC with letters accusing me of being an unregenerate sexist, stay your hand, for it's not me. I'm just the messenger in this matter. It's the Chinese these days who are being unregenerately sexist. Where last Christmas, if you wanted a calendar with a pretty girl on it, it was a real status symbol. You had to persuade a relative to bring it in from abroad or buy it on the black market. This winter, they're being sold on every street corner. The centerfold of China Youth, a monthly magazine which sells millions of copies all over China, has a pull-out calendar with what could be a scene from a Chinese version of Love Story. A girl in a frilly lace blouse worn off the shoulder on a hillside photographed against the light. Just the kind of dreamy, sugary romanticism that was anathema in Mao's day. Nor is it just a matter of calendars. There's hardly an advertising hoarding that doesn't have a pretty face promoting something or other. Whether you think that's a good or a bad thing, it does at least make China more like other countries. And that's really the second point that struck me from that railway kiosk calendar. It's not simply pin-up girls, but much else about Chinese life, at least in the big cities, that's growing more and more like Hong Kong or Taiwan. Go for a walk down Qianmen, one of the main shopping streets here, and it's alive with hawkers and street sellers, young men selling sticks of toffied crab apples and oranges, chestnuts polished until each one shines, and the Chinese equivalent of vulgar postcards, with all the zest and good humor of barrow boys in the North End Road. The Press Club has reopened for the first time in 15 years, and Chinese journalists talk of setting up a restaurant and a coffee bar. Not quite Elvino's, perhaps, but a place where the Chinese equivalent of Fleet Street, the lads from the People's Daily and the Workers' Daily, can congregate of an evening. Apart from the latest political gossip, the subject that's uppermost in their minds, and indeed of most Chinese at the moment, is rising prices. Inflation was officially put at nearly 6% last year. Unofficially, it's estimated at nearer 10% this year, and meal allowances for members of Parliament have gone up 25%. The result has been a price freeze, throwing into confusion the leadership's plans to give freer play to market forces. If it all sounds depressingly familiar, even that arch-apostle of monetarism, Milton Friedman, has been lecturing here. Well, that familiarity is precisely the point. China is encountering all the problems that the simplistic unrealities of Maoism used to shelter it from, and the Chinese people are increasingly acquiring the same mundane preoccupations as the rest of us. Of course, China has its own special problems too. A friend of mine has a young son with a gift for classical Chinese poetry, and when he goes to university, he wants to study Chinese literature. But his father isn't so sure. He thinks he'd be better off studying science, even though he hasn't much interest in it. Why? Because by the very nature of the subject, a scientist will be much less vulnerable to any future political storms than an arts graduate will be. He's not the only parent to have made that calculation. As a result, China's suffering from a chronic shortage of students who want to specialize in liberal arts. That kind of problem isn't going to go away soon, but already it's true to say China's no longer a place for the rest of the world to exclaim over, as though looking at it down the wrong end of a telescope. The problems of revolution are receding. In their place, the Chinese people are having to learn to live with the problems of normalcy.
Philip Short, Peking. Now, South Africa, and from John Thorne in Johannesburg, a picture of daily life for one particular black South African.
Matthew cannot be described as typical of modern black life in South Africa, but his story is an example of the burden, the hardship, even suffering that an ordinary black citizen can expect to endure merely as part of the daily routine of surviving. Matthew has got a fairly good job in the accounts department of one of the British companies quietly doing such good business in South Africa. He earns about 200 rand a month, an average wage for his semi-skilled job. The office is in a white suburb of Johannesburg, a good 5 miles from the black township of Soweto, which is the legal urban home for Matthew. His government-designated homeland is Venda, the quasi-independent rural national state on the northern border with Zimbabwe, which is probably one of the poorest black homelands in South Africa. Until last month, the inconvenience of that long commuting journey from Soweto, involving a 6:30 a.m. start with the hundreds of thousands of other black workers who struggle into Johannesburg by train and bus, the inconvenience was bypassed quite illegally by having a room in the servants' quarters of a white family home in a leafy inner suburb. The room, cramped, a bit damp and unfurnished, cost Matthew nothing. He lived there with his girlfriend Gertrude, who was a shift worker on the wards of a white private hospital. This illegal base was paid for in kind, a day's work at the weekend in the landlord's garden, keeping the flower beds trimmed, the lawns cut and the cars washed. Matthew was a happy, intelligent, uncomplicated young man. He spoke and understood 7 languages, including English and Afrikaans, and was very proud of it. He loved children and chess. He played rugby or football in the garden with the children until it was too dark to see the ball. He followed avidly English First Division soccer. He knew when Liam Brady had been transferred to Juventus before a paragraph appeared in the South African newspapers. His love of boxing had him huddled over his transistor radio listening to faraway commentaries in Xhosa or Zulu. It's a strange quirk of the lifestyle in South Africa that the Calvinistic Afrikaner frowns on sports broadcasts for whites on Sunday, but allows them in the various black languages. Matthew played football for a black team most Sundays. His side was not very successful and was thrashed in the cup competition. And on other Sundays, he attended mandatory meetings of his burial society way out of Johannesburg. The burial society is a link with the homelands for urban blacks, an insurance for the inevitable final future. Occasionally, Matthew asked to watch the television in the main house, usually to follow a sports program, but he was also interested in the news broadcasts, which he recognized without any particular anger as another arm of the government's control. In fact, there was very little anger in Matthew. He accepted the South African system of passes, annual registrations, restrictions and privilege. But he was existing in a twilight world that could not last for long. He and his girlfriend didn't get their wages supplemented by weekly supplies of meat and mealie meal like most maids and gardeners do. But nor did he have to go and stand at recognized pick-up corners on the outskirts of the city on holidays and weekends, like hundreds of other black men do, racing across to every truck or van that drew up, hoping to get taken on casually for a day's labouring work, moving someone's garden rubbish or digging out a swimming pool. But an end came to Matthew's way of life because of recent legislation tightening up on the control on black South Africans, where they live, whether their husbands or children could stay with them. This legislation meant that Matthew's landlord was liable to a 500 rand fine if the authorities ever found him. So Matthew and Gertrude had to go. Last week they sent a Christmas card to the family they left to return to the vast, dangerous, anonymous township of Soweto. There was no bitterness or resentment, just a resigned acceptance of fate. Matthew wrote inside the card in rather garbled English, "I am saying very thanks with all your help and gifts you have done for me. But it was just a matter of time or facts that separated us. Wishing you all a very joyful stay and living. Yours sincerely, Matthew and Gertrude."
John Thorne, Johannesburg. In Italy, it's been a year of disasters, natural and man-made, and people are asking why as the year draws to an end. As David Willey reports from Rome, the questions of public morality are preoccupying the Italians.
There was an unusual atmosphere of moral earnestness filling the air and the leader pages in Italy this Christmas, which might have caused a stranger landing suddenly in Rome to conclude that the second coming was just around the corner, and that Italians were girding themselves with righteousness in preparation. The truth, however, was much more prosaic. A crop of public scandals involving ministers, senior police officers, and a whole cohort of civil servants who are facing possible criminal prosecutions for dipping their fingers into the public purse has received unprecedented notice in the media. Let me just tell you about one such scandal to give the flavour. A prominent Sicilian businessman went to Japan a few years ago to buy 3 new passenger ferries. He paid a sum of several millions of pounds cash for each vessel. But what was not known at the time was that he already had in his pocket a signed contract from the Italian state to lease back his ferries for 5 years for a sum equivalent to twice the initial purchase price. The multi-million-pound profit was split up among, as they say here in Italy, friends of friends, all in high places. Now, it's not that no official machinery exists to check on such double dealing, but simply that there's such a sophisticated warning system built into the various watchdog bodies supposed to guard the public interest that important public figures rarely get hurt. Recently, however, the built-in safety system hasn't always worked as well as it should, and the smell of scandal has been so strong that solemn conclaves of party leaders have been taking place to discuss, as they quaintly put it, public morality. Well, just in the middle of this tardy recognition that the dispensing of favours by those in power might have got slightly out of hand, God's wrath, in the shape of a mighty earthquake, descended upon the poor south of Italy. Last month's earthquake finally laid bare the results of years of misgovernment in the Mezzogiorno, the land where the midday sun shines hot, but where at this time of year the mountains are covered with snow, and the villages of Irpinia and Basilicata look for all the world like picture book Christmas crib villages from the helicopters flying in aid to the victims. Gun law is now rampant in the earthquake zone. Even the government commissioner in charge of relief operations has received threats against his life and has to travel around in a bulletproof car. Homeless families in Naples, and they now number tens of thousands, are having to pay key money to criminals for the privilege of a miserable roof over their heads for Christmas. 2 successive government plans to evacuate earthquake victims foundered simply because there was no basic research undertaken. No public servant actually asked the simple question, what sort of accommodation do these people actually want? Elaborate arrangements were made for the requisitioning of isolated holiday homes, which not only infuriated the owners, but were also rejected by the families supposed to be billeted there. Sometimes justice is done in this quest for moral improvement, and sometimes it's not. My best story of misguided individual enterprise to beat the system concerns, however, not a highly placed civil servant, but a Neapolitan traffic cop, who simply got tired of directing impossible traffic jams last summer. He refused to forego his salary and furnished himself with false doctor's certificates. He went on holiday to Cyprus, liked the life there, and got a temporary job, playing the piano in the bar in the island's top hotel. After 3 months' paid absence from point duty, questions began to be asked by his bosses in Naples. They decided to sack him, and for all I know, holidaymakers in Nicosia are still humming Santa Lucia and applauding the piano-playing policemen as they sip their whiskies. It's not that Italians are any more or less dishonest than people anywhere else, but simply that it's never occurred to those in power here to question the basic assumption that in any conflict between private and public interest, private interest always wins. A cartoon in one weekly magazine shows, or rather doesn't show, the leader of Italy's ruling party in bed with his wife. "What's the matter? Can't you sleep?" says the wife. "No," he replies, "I'm worried about the moral question." "What," she retorts, "at your age?"
David Willey, Rome. Finally, Cairo, where daily life is a mixture of the familiar and the bizarre, the obvious similarities with any big city, and the peculiarly Egyptian. Here's our Cairo correspondent, Bob Jobbins.
Life in Cairo, perhaps in any big city, is a hectic affair. The pushing, jostling crowds, the endless streams of traffic, the noise. The pace is exaggerated by the turmoil, by the overladen, turbaned porters, the muscles in their necks straining against the weight of vast bundles supported by straps around their foreheads, forcing their way through narrow alleys against a tide of people. By the donkey carts urged on by shrill-voiced boys as they struggle over the slippery, uneven cobbles to carry improbable loads across packed main roads. There are hawkers, peddlers, beggars, soft drink sellers, sweet potato stands, and the babble of voices with street cries which have barely changed for centuries. And yet Cairo is also a city of leisure, of calm corners, of repose. The stately Boabin, the doorman, part concierge, part watchman, often a grave Nubian from the south of Egypt, sitting, smoking and chatting as the crowds pour past. There are the courtyards of the great mosques, pools of silence, where only the occasional group of tourists intrude on the prayers or meditation of the religious. And of course, the river. In spite of the huge Nile barges ploughing past and the noisy river buses, the Nile is a refuge from the hubbub, the heat and the dirt. The serenity of the feluccas with their broad lateen sails, the peace of drifting in the river makes the city seem a distant dream rather than a close reality, with the overworked buses pounding down the corniche, with the passengers clinging desperately to the doors. Even the trains, as they inch out of the city south following the river to Luxor and Aswan, with passengers riding the buffers or reclining precariously on the roof, slide past a landscape of magic colours and tremendous peace. The children barely look up, and the creak of the water wheel as the blindfolded buffalo trudges endlessly round is the only sound heard above the rustle of the date palms in the breeze. But back in the city, the real oasis is the cafe. Some just a few chairs in a muddy alleyway, some ornate palaces of rusted mirrors and chipped marble. These are the preserve of the men. They gather to talk, politics, mere gossip, discuss football, and watch life go by. As the city surges past, they puff reflectively at their shishas, the water pipe, and complain about prices, or sip their slightly sweetened coffee, the interminable mazboot, and swap political jokes, or on special days gather to watch their favourite teams, perhaps Zamalek and Ahli, do battle again for the football cup. For the intellectuals, there's the Café Riche, or Groppies, once the tea room for the British community, where the subjects and many of the jokes are the same, and the coffee slightly worse. While the middle classes gather on the terrace by the pool at the Gazira Club, or sit by the croquet lawns, meeting friends and chatting. And it's in these cafes, from the poorest and the most rudimentary collection of broken chairs in a corner of the bazaar, to the still elegant clubs, where much of the business of Cairo is transacted. Workmen find work, tradesmen customers, businessmen strike deals. Problems which seem insoluble across an office desk, even with the help of a mazboot or two, are miraculously solved by friends meeting over a game of trick-track and a shared pipe. The cafes are clubs for people from the same area of town, or perhaps from the same part of Egypt who've come to live in Cairo, for people from the same professions. And if you're trying to track down somebody to help you and he's not at home, then the best bet is his favourite cafe, because even if he's not there, he will be by the time you've had a coffee. But the Egyptians still retain a tight-knit family life, links far stronger than any others, and a pathway through the city can be cleared with the right connections, passing you from cousin to uncle to brother, with a word of recommendation. So, for the foreigner, much of the city is shut off. Much of the life is lived behind closed doors, with only the occasional tantalizing glimpse of how ordinary Egyptians live, perhaps because of an invitation to a wedding when the traditional part of Egyptian life reasserts itself. And the volley of rifle shots, the wild ululating cries and the frantic drumming of the music remind you that in spite of the traffic, the skyscrapers, the Western dress, Cairo is a very foreign and exciting city.
That report from Bob Jobbins in Cairo ends this edition of From Our Own Correspondent. Our next edition is on Tuesday morning at 10:02.
From Our Own Correspondent was introduced by Laurie Macmillan. The editor is Paddy O'Keefe. Next, the news, and in 2 minutes we look ahead to 1981, the financial prospects in Moneybox.